Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we explore the early designs of a famous weapon, pieces of jewelry gifted to loved ones during wartime, and several cutlasses showing the blade's evolution through years of battle. A swordsmith shows Kevin British naval cutlasses showing its evolution through the years.
These were issued on land and called a hanger, and when issued at sea, oftentimes just called a cutlass. They both did the same thing.
Jennifer examines a collection of sweetheart jewelry from the Second World War.
A heart represents forever true and forever loving, so a lot of the jewelry was in the shape of a heart.
Mark looks at an early inventor's model for the famous Winchester Lee Navy rifle.
He was able in his career to do a job that combined with his passion, and that's very rare to see that.
I'm Bruce Ellis, and I had the pleasure to bring in a pre-patent inventor's rough model of what was to become the U.S. 1895 Navy magazine rifle.
Born on August 9, 1831, British-Canadian turned American arms designer James Paris Lee relocated to Canada with his family in 1836, where he crafted his first gun by the tender age of 12. In 1858, Lee emigrated with his wife to Wisconsin. There, he set his sights on the United States military and began submitting designs to help arm the American Civil War. He experienced partial success with his early concepts, but it was his bolt action and box magazine models that became the primary building blocks of his legacy. Seen in the historically celebrated Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifles, and their predecessor, the Lee Navy M1895. Throughout both World Wars, weapons bearing his name were standard across British Commonwealth and American infantries, and are still found among many military forces today.
Well, I'd like to welcome Bruce Ellis to the set here today.
Thank you.
And it's great to have you along, Mr. Ellis, for the show. And you brought a couple of interesting items from your personal collection today. So what are we looking at here? Obviously, rifles. What exactly are they?
What we're looking at is the U.S. Winchester Lee Navy rifle. When we say Lee, we're talking about the same guy as the Lee Enfield that everybody carried for 3 wars. This is the finished piece. This is the one that went off in the Spanish-American War and in the China Relief Expedition. This is the one that Lee sat in his workshop with a jackknife and a coping saw and said, how do I get to this patent drawing, to this? So this is literally the inventor's model.
So what time period are we talking here? And how long was the development between actually creating his mock-up to the original in production?
I think we're looking at about 4.5 very interesting years.
And that would be from,
let's say, 1890. After this was put into production and served very well in military service, Winchester thought, this was okay for the Navy, but we have a new cartridge for the Army, and we don't want to have 2 cartridges. Doesn't make sense. Supply is a problem. So they said, let's scale this up. So they did. They put about 1 inch around the whole thing and all the parts. And you've got this extremely heavy mechanical prototype on the wooden, but a steel one. So they took it fairly seriously. They felt that they had a good product, but they just wanted to sort of bring it up to date, as it were. So this stuck around, I think they stopped issuing them around 1910. And then they were brought out in World War I, which in the U.S. was 1917, 1918, as a secondary fill-in, give it to guards who probably won't see any action type of thing. So waste not, want not.
So this is the production model. This is a pre-production model that he created?
Yeah, this is almost the pre-model model. At one time, we think it was bigger. Gene Mazankowski wrote a book on these, and this particular piece is in the book. But when Gene and I talked about this, it probably at one time was a complete long rifle, because there was a lot of fiddling going on with bits and parts and so forth. And it's fitted for having a barrel, which it doesn't have, but it just concentrates now on the action. You just pull back on the action, it opens, push it forward, it feeds, spits out the empties. Mechanically, it's very sound.
How did you acquire this piece, and do you have any provenance to that?
Oh yeah. Fortunately, Gene wrote the book first, and then inside, and this is what we call documented or published. Published is a term which boosts the resale of whatever was published. This little dark picture here is in fact this. And the fellow that bought this from the Lee family bought lots of Lee material, everything he could get. He and I met. He thought it was time to move it along, and he asked me. And I asked my wife, and then I asked the bank, and there it is.
So how did you get into collecting this stuff?
When I was about 5 years old, my folks went house hunting, and they stopped at an antique store. Back then, they had these wonderful nail kegs with a sign, any bayonet or sword in this keg, $3. What 5-year-old wouldn't want basically a sword? Because I was a little guy and this was a big bayonet. And I had $2.50 in my pocket. And my father loaned me 50 cents. And I was hooked. That was it. And I worked with retail firearms establishments over the years. I was an armorer initially in the U.S. Army in small arms. Later, I was a military curator, and I was in the forensic department of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in firearms and tool marks. So my avocation became my vocation.
Which is rare sometimes to get that.
Yeah,
Actually.
but really lucky.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Ellis for bringing his rifles and the prototype of this. And obviously it's rare to see such good examples of a turn-of-the-century rifle and its prototype. So what ultimately do you want your collection to be, and what do you see its future?
I've got to find a home for this stuff. I've started to put parts of the inventory out for offers. This could easily go to a museum. It'll find a home. I'm sure there will be someone in the next couple of years who thinks that this is something that should be preserved and enjoyed.
Well, that's great. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
The thing today that comes across is Mr. Ellis's passion for the item, and obviously his unique knowledge of how the equipment works. And obviously he was able in his career to do a job that combined with his passion, and that's very rare to see that. And I think that we certainly saw that on display today.
Coming up on Militaria.
And it represents an era in Canadian naval history where war and remembrance and love and romance were all symbolized in the form of jewelry. My name is Lisa McNiven, and I've brought in a collection of sweetheart jewelry from the Royal Canadian Navy.
Made popular during the First and Second World Wars, sweetheart jewellery, though characteristically small, was enormously sentimental. While millions of letters and photographs crossed the oceans between 1914 and 1945, bearing their own significance, sweetheart jewellery was something one could not only carry, but also display on their person as a tribute to loved ones abroad or in solidarity with all awaiting safe returns. Due to metal rationing, these wartime keepsakes were set in varying materials, including sterling silver, lucite, and tin, and often took the form of military badges. Servicemen and women would select purchases from catalogues and in-store, sometimes opting for custom-made or handcrafted variation. Regardless of the jewelry's simplicity or complexity, the intention to nurture meaningful connections from afar was always upheld and deeply appreciated.
Hello, Lisa. Welcome back to Militaria. I see here that you've brought us some beautiful pieces of jewelry. Can you tell me a bit about them?
Sure. These are commonly known as sweetheart pins or sweetheart jewelry, and it's a beautiful collection of RCNVR and RN Royal Navy lockets, brooches, necklaces, pins. And it represents an era in Canadian naval history where war and remembrance and love and romance were all symbolized in the form of jewelry.
And I notice here there's quite a variation between the different pieces. Could you tell me a little bit about each piece?
Sure. I personally like the RCN VR diamond brooch. It gives you an indication of time, early World War II, and it's a beautiful diamond and platinum gold setting with a little bit of enamel. We have a necklace that's either resin or plastic and a lovely little locket. And we have what may have sat on a pendant and a brooch.
Lisa, I see here that some of the pieces have Royal Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserve on them and others have Royal Canadian Navy. So how would men who were either officers or ratings order these sweetheart pieces? I mean, they'd be overseas serving on ships. So how would their wife or their girlfriends receive these pieces of jewelry? And why would they buy these kind of pieces of jewelry for them?
Some of these would have been mail order. So while a sailor is serving on ship or overseas, there was an option for him to fill out a gift certificate either in the back of a magazine or a newspaper. And that way, it's early mail delivery of jewelry that could reach home. Also, there were, I'm sure, local jewelers. I'm assuming that the beautiful diamond brooch may have came from the prestigious Canadian jeweler Burke's.
Lisa, I see here in this collection that there's quite a different variety of pieces of jewelry. I mean, we have some that are made from plastic, some made from silver, and some that have beautiful diamonds in them. Can you speak to that, just that variation in the variety of the different pieces of jewelry we have here?
I think that the jewelries represent a common denominator of a token of love. Tokens of love come in resin, and they also come in silver, and they come in diamonds. The message overall is remembrance and love and commitment also.
So it's not the individual value of each piece, it's what it actually represents.
What it represents. I like to envision the thought of perhaps a sailor on a convoy crossing the Atlantic, and he has a mail order catalog, and he's rifling through the pages looking for that symbol or that lovely piece of jewelry that he could send home to let his loved one know that she's not forgotten and that she's always in his memory.
It's interesting because at this time, from 39 to 45 in the Royal Canadian Navy, we start to see a lot of that Canadian identity come out of the Navy. It was at this time that Canadian sailors and officers were like, I'm Canadian. Started to wear the Canadian flashes and have more Canadian distinctions on their uniforms and being very proud of that. And so these sweetheart pens are almost a reflection of that continual pride of, I'm serving in the Canadian Navy. My family is participating in the war and participating in this Navy that's doing such a wonderful thing, such as protecting our convoys going to Europe.
Exactly. It was definitely an identification, a marker for your wife, your sweetheart, friend, sister, to wear this piece of jewelry. It was an indication that your counterpart was serving and doing his duty.
So these pieces of jewelry not only represented a type of pride, saying that my family member is serving or my significant other, but also if that individual happened to be lost during a time of war, these sweetheart pens, would you say, represent that remembrance of as remembering that they were there and that they lost their lives, almost a war remembrance piece?
Absolutely. Once again, a personal indicator. If you wore it on a daily occurrence, it would be a daily reminder for you and for your group of friends or community that were around you that this was your sacrifice and you're wearing basically your heart, especially with the locket, which is absolutely charming.
What I find interesting about these pieces is that they wore them to say, yes, I had a husband or a significant other serving in the Navy, in the armed forces. And that kind of speaks to that history that unfortunately there were people in our society that would shame people if their family members weren't participating in the war. And so these pieces were not only mementos of love and remembrance, but they were active pieces saying that our family's serving, we're participating, we're supporting the war. When men would try to enlist, and if they were rejected due to common medical issues such as color blindness, or that they had sustained an injury even during the First World War and tried to enlist in the Second, a lot of these men would be criticized for not going to war. And so eventually there was a system that came up where they wore pins to identify that I tried to enlist, please respect that. And so even though these sweetheart pens are mementos of remembrance and good memories and of love, they also represent that patriotic side and that sense of we are serving, we are doing what we can for the war.
Jewelry is a representation, and it has so many languages and so many messages.
Lisa, thank you for bringing these beautiful artifacts in. Could you tell me currently what's being done with these sweetheart pins at the museum?
Some of the pins are on display throughout our museum, and other pins are waiting for new exhibits so that we can expand and tell the story on the tradition of sweetheart pins and jewelry.
Thank you again, Lisa, for bringing in these beautiful pieces of jewelry for us to see today.
You're welcome.
My initial thoughts on today's pieces are what wonderful artifacts that speak to the history of the Royal Canadian Navy during a time of war. It's not a traditional piece that we usually collect at the museum, but over the years we have seen sweetheart pens and other civilian mementos of the war and of the RCN during the wartime come into the museum. So I always find them very special because they come with personal stories, and they come with that aspect of that individuals are never forgotten, even when they're at sea.
Coming up on Militaria.
The swords you've brought, these tell a story of, or an arc almost, like in the story of edged weapons used by the Royal Navy and by privateers. My name's Nick Skinner. I brought in today two British naval cutlasses, the model P-1804s and one 1790s variant reproduction.
Tracing back to the Bronze Age, the sword, in its many forms, has maintained a steady presence throughout history. In 1804, as its coalition forces prepared to face down the French Empire in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain armed its naval services with the first military-issued cutlass, a robust, multi-purpose sabre favoured by seafarers. The P-1804 was carried by the Royal Navy in the Battle of Trafalgar, helping to claim its decisive victory over French and Spanish forces. Now an embodiment of early modern warfare, the continued evolution of the cutlass has perpetuated its legacy from a combat essential to ceremonial service piece.
I'd like to welcome Nick Skinner to Militaria today.
Thank you.
If you could tell us what you've brought in today.
I brought in a collection of swords, a few original pieces, and a couple reproductions I've made that will show us the evolution of the British naval cutlass from around circa 1700 right through to 1804.
Now, Nick, the swords you've brought and the way you've laid them out here in sort of chronological order, these tell a story of, or an arc almost, like in the story of edged weapons used by the Royal Navy and by privateers. I was wondering if you could just, in a Cole's Notes version, basically kind of show us how the requirement and the need for standardized forms will lead to the P-1804 from the time of the mid-18th century when hangers are still being used and called as such.
Early on, they found that they needed a short sword for fighting on shipboard in close quarters. And during the whole time frame of the cutlass, you'll find this style of sword referred to as a hanger.
Yes.
And depending on what country you come from as well, these could have various names aboard ship. So you could find a hanger hilted sword like this aboard a ship, let's say in 1690 or 1700, and it would be referred to as either a hanger or a cutlass by the British, or if you were from France or Spain or one of those places, the translation was boarding saber, which it just naturally, it's a saber. It's got a short curved blade made for boarding a ship. These were issued on land and
called a hanger, and when issued at sea, oftentimes just called a cutlass. By the 1720s, we start to see change in this, because these were quite expensive to produce, and in the numbers that they required them in, they had to come up with a better method of mass production that was more cost efficient. By the 1720s, we see a slow evolution over to swords kind of like this one, using tubular iron handles and the flat sheet steel or sheet iron figure 8 guard. And that style carried on basically unchanged from the 1720s right through to the 1780s. And come the 1790s, we start to see another evolution in blades. My observation is they were trying to simplify things even more, because they needed more arms.
Yep.
And they start to switch from the tubular iron grips over to these cast iron grips. And from a curved blade to a straight blade, you'll find this style of sword starts to show itself with the iron grip around 1800. By 1804, it had evolved into this sword. And this became the first official British issue cutlass, the P1804.
Now, with that, like you're saying about like provenience and where these things come from, how did you acquire some of these? You have a great story about how you found one of those swords. I'm sure people would like to hear that.
So this one here
Right.
was found in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, by a friend of mine who wandered into this junk shop and was looking around, and up on the wall was this sword, and someone had spray painted it all. It was silver paint. And he said, well, that looks like a cutlass. So he took it home.
Yeah.
And gave it a little soak and cleaned some of that paint off of it. And then he found the name on it. And eventually, like a couple of years after that, it came to me. And I reached out to a collector in England, an arms dealer there in England, who said that Thomas Craven had the first contract. And he feels that this was made in the first year of the P1804 issue of Cutlass.
Well, Nick, I'd really like to thank you on behalf of the program and everybody at home, I'm sure, for bringing these things in, sharing us your extensive knowledge of this type of weaponry. Now, Nick, what does the future hold for some of these originals that you've brought in today?
Well, this one will stay in my personal collection, and then after that's my wife's problem. And this one will go back to the man I borrowed it from.
Well, I'd like to thank you for coming in today, Nick, and sharing your experience and your collection with us. Again, bladesmith, scholar, Renaissance man, Nick Skinner, right here today. Thanks so much for everything.
It was a pleasure.
Well, I think, again, these things, they take us back, these artifacts, as all things do, depending on the period they come from. They are a direct line to that time in history. This is an extremely violent time to be a member of the Royal or American Navy or a privateer. People sometimes, with the passage of time and sea shanties and folk tunes and stuff, we sometimes forget the actual brutality of life at sea and the war at sea. And these cutlasses take us right immediately to that. When you pick up a cutlass, it's got one use, okay? And it's a dark one.